My current view as of December 2020 is the following: 4 points. Muhammad's biography is a composite fiction based on a real historical protagonist whose story is very different, numerous later figures, and biblical typographies from that of Jesus and Moses. Number 2, this chief political protagonist on whom Muhammad is based had nothing to do with the formation of the Quran. The Quran, which is a misnomer, was largely the correspondence of preachers in a Judeo-Christian sect, and the tafsirs in the Quran have misinterpreted the meaning of the Quran. These are big statements I'm making. Number 3, the beginnings of Islam occurred in the north, mostly in Iraq, Syria, and the Jordan area. And lastly, early sources are not only able to confront that this standard Islamic narrative is wrong, but they can identify the evolution from the old, mostly historical narrative to the new, mostly fictional narrative. So that's where I'm at the moment.
Wow, so those are big. I mean, what you're saying there is very big, because you're actually going into these, and if people could just remember these 4 points, that the idea of Muhammad's biography is a composite, that this 7th century Muhammad has nothing to do with the 9th century Muhammad. Maybe that's the best way to put it. The 7th century Muhammad is nothing like the 9th century Muhammad, and that the beginning of Islam occurred in the north, that we're going from north to south, and we're also going from Ilya ibn Qabisa to the Muhammad that we find in the 9th century. And then the last one is that these early sources that you're coming across, all this material that you guys at Seekers Forum are coming across, it not only confronts that standard narrative, but also helps us along the building blocks, gives a building block to how we came to those. So, and I think this has been a question that many of the viewers keep coming up with. Help us to put this all together, because we're getting confused. Are you saying it's Petra? Are you saying it's Iraq? Are you saying it's southern Turkey? All these different things, these different places on the map. Are you saying it's the 6th century, 7th century that things start to change to the 8th century? What are you saying? Because we're throwing so much new material at them. What you're going to be doing, and I think this is one of the nice things about this particular segment, you're going to show that this did not happen immediately. It happened and evolved slowly. But as you watch and look the trajectory, you will see these early sources take you on the trajectory. We can now are starting to put it together, and it is flowing, and it does not confront each other. It does not contradict each other. It complements the almost all the material that you've been coming across.
I think the hardest thing maybe for some people to accept is the idea that Muhammad had nothing to do with the formation of the Quran, and I think that's the biggest one. Because once you
that's a pretty big one for a good reason. You've just shut down everything that Islam is dependent on, the Book of the Man. I mean, you can see why they're gonna be an awful lot of people that are angry with you, what you're doing here, because you're not only just taking on the man itself. You're not just taking also the whole emergence of this quickly growing second largest religion on earth. You're also confronting that which this man was supposedly sent to earth to do, and that is to receive this revelation. You're hitting both the book and the man simultaneously.
Yeah, these are two parallel things that are happening in the 7th century, and people have assumed that both of these are connected. But what I'm suggesting, that the evidence suggests that there's a political genesis and there's a religious genesis, and these are not connected. They can connected in the time of Abdul al-Malik, but before that, these were distinct movements. And by thinking that they're one and the same movement, it leads to lots of confusion. But once you decouple that, it's much easier to see what's really going on. So there we have it on that. So in this first half then, first part 1, I'm going to be arguing that the standard narrative is wrong. In part 2, who was the main protagonist for the political genesis of the revolution that later became known as Islam. So part 1, the standard Islamic narrative is wrong. I'm going to suggest there were at least 2 standard Islamic narratives: the northern narrative, most of which has been expunged from the records, and the southern narrative. The standard Islamic narrative that we have today is essentially the southern narrative. Now, a quote from Thomas the Presbyter. You've seen this, I'm sure, many times. Mm-hmm. There was a battle between the Romans and the Tayyaye of Muhammad in Palestine, 12 miles east of Gaza. You will hear almost nothing about the Tayyaye in the standard Islamic narrative. Why? That should concern us. Why have the Tayyaye been painted out of the picture? Why have they been airbrushed out? There's obviously.
Oh, that's interesting. So they've been expunged, you think, intentionally, and that you're gonna. That's. I assume you're gonna say that. If you isn't this symptomatic of what you do? As if you're a new ruler, if you're a new emperor, if you are new coming into a new empire, what's the first thing you want to do? You want to eradicate your predecessors.
Yeah, and there's going to. I'm going to show you why it was why they were got rid of. Essentially, as an identifier, it became redundant as an identifier, and this is largely to do with the splits and infighting that went on in the Tayyaye, as we'll see later. And that's why the tribal name got changed, and then a subgroup within the Tayyaye was emphasized. But I suppose to start with, who were they? Who are the Tayyaye? So this is very key to understanding what happened. Well, first of all, the Tayyaye are referred to as the Tay. They're also known as Tayyi. It is a large and ancient Arab tribe, and the patronymic of Tay is Al-Tayyi, if I pronounced it correctly. When did the Tayyaye move north? So in the 2nd century CE, the Tayyaye migrated from Yemen to the northern Arabian mountain ranges of Jabal Shamar, which was formerly called Jabal Tay, as you can see where it is. And notice where it's located, which is south of Petra. And this is going to be key because, as we'll see in a moment, they'll move further north from there again and spread out.
Just interject real quickly. Is this Edom?
No, Edom is further north than this. So you're talking a few hundred miles further north. So if you take, say, the letter M there of Shamar, it's above that again. So
okay. So these people originally came from Yemen, way down in the south. What is today Yemen? What used to be the Hadramaut back then. I have to keep on saying that so you don't get hammered by people that say you don't know what you're talking about. Yemen is the modern day reference for what used to be the Hadramaut, that southern area. And so you're talking about 2nd century. You're talking about a good 600 years before Islam came into being, or as we know it today. So this is long, long in the past.
Yeah. So like their connection with Yemen has pretty much gone at this stage by the time of the 2nd century, and they would have a vague memory of their connections with Yemen. Maybe they maintain some form of trading connection, maybe perhaps, but beyond that, they're now identifying themselves as a northern tribe from the 2nd century onwards.
What would Shamad be today? Is that Jordan? I suppose Petra.
It would be Jordan and northern Arabia, northern Saudi Arabia. As far I'd have to check it against a map just to see where the borders end and so on. But
this would be Nabatea then. Jordan. These would be Nabateans.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, definitely would be within the Nabatean region. Yeah. Okay. Now, in the late 6th century, the Fasad War split the Tayyaye, with members of its Jadila branch converting to Christianity and migrating to Syria, where they became allied with the Ghassanids, and the Goth branch remaining in Jabal Tay. The Tayyaye also became well established in the Lakhmid region too. So where you see the Ghassanid kingdom there on the left-hand side, that would be equivalent to Syria, more or less. And the Lakhmid area to the east would be more or less equivalent to Iraq. Okay, now obviously the frontiers change over time, but as a rough approximate, that would be fair enough. The Ghassanid kingdom obviously covered the Jordan area in modern day Middle East. Okay, so essentially what you have there is you have the Tayyaye that are spreading north and then having an influence in those areas. Now, the Tayyaye identifier became a less useful marker of identity over time as splits increased, as we'll see. The Tayyaye were split during the first fitna, with those based in Arabia and Iraq supporting Ali as caliph, and those in Syria supporting Muawiyah. Nonetheless, a branch of the Tay under Kataba ibn Shabib were among the leaders of the Abbasid revolution, which toppled the Umayyads in the middle of the 8th century. the Tay fared well under the Abbasids, producing military officials. So as you can see, they may have split, but they continue to have an influence.
So we're talking about now, we're talking about 660, because that's when Muawiyah comes to power.
Yeah.
So 650, 660s.
Yeah. Okay. Now what's interesting, okay, we can see where they're dominating. The Tayyeh dominated the Lakhmid region so much that the area of Mesopotamia became known as Tashkistan in the 7th century. Isn't that interesting that they were so dominant that the name of the area got changed to Tashkistan, which means land of the Tay.
Oh, okay. This is not the same as Tajikistan that we use today.
No, there's a linguistic connection, which I'll actually touch on later in the PowerPoint. But just to give you a rough idea of their sphere of influence in the 7th century, you can see it's quite extensive. So into what we would call today Iraq, northern and southern Iraq towards the east, and in the west in the region what we would call today Syria and the Jordan. So it's quite an extensive sphere of influence. Now, in terms of the overall population of these areas, these were a subgroup, but a very influential and powerful group within the overall population. Okay. Now, what's interesting is the central Hijaz was outside the Tayyeh sphere of influence, i.e., where the standard Islamic narrative says Muhammad began Islam. So do you see the disconnect between Muhammad and the Tayyeh if you hold to the standard Islamic narrative? So we're kind of see how in the historical sources we're seeing a link between the Tayyeh and Muhammad, and yet in the standard Islamic narrative there's an obvious disconnect there. It's a hole in the narrative, to use a very famous person's words.
Becoming less so as the days go on.
Yeah. Early sources indicate the standard Islamic narrative doesn't square up with what actually happened. So the northern narrative
are you implicitly implying that the standard Islamic narrative is a sin? I love the word you're using to incorporate that. Your acronyms are bursting with information. I'm sure that's not lost on the audience.
I couldn't resist that one. I was too.
You're waiting for someone to jump in to say that too, weren't you?
I was. Yeah. I'm a bit of a joker. Right. The northern narrative. This is the earliest narrative, and traces of this earlier narrative survived long after the newer narrative took over. So this is going to be key. Okay, so let's build up this narrative then. So these early sources give an indication of the information that was available at that time and would have been part of the overall narrative and the overall sort of knowledge that people had at that time. So Thomas the Presbyter, you have the dates there. It's dated to 634. There was a battle between the Romans and the Tayyeh of Muhammad in Palestine, 12 miles east of Gaza. Now, the reason for the early dating of this 640 CE is because of the precision of the dating there. It's clearly very close to the time. And we see that the Tayyeh is connected with Muhammad. Now, note the group he's associated with, the location of the event, which is, as you can see, east of Gaza, and to a lesser degree, the source of the information, Mesopotamia, because that's where it was written, are all indicators that it's up in the north. Isn't that interesting?
Okay.
Note also the name or title given, Muhammad, is spelt with a T, which indicates it is a Pahlavi word, which is the language of Sasanian Persia. So we're getting a hint really here that there's a Persian link, there's a Persian connection, and everything about this suggests that Muhammad is linked to the north, even though this is a very short source. So there's a lot in this, and it's easy to overlook so much of the significance of this.
Now, just so people are understanding, when you're saying Romans, you mean Byzantine.
The Byzantine, yeah. They would have been still called the Romans into that era. In fact, if we were to use Byzantines, that they would know what we're talking about. The Byzantines are what we call them now, but back in those days, they wouldn't have been referred to as the Byzantines.
just so because people will probably say, you're not saying this is all happening in Italy. No, this is happening. This is the Byzantine Empire that was headquartered up there in Constantinople.
Yeah. Okay. And then we also have the fragment on the Arab conquests, which is written even earlier, 636 AD. And many villages were ruined with killing by blank. We don't know what was written there, Muhammad. And a great number of people were killed and captives were taken from Galilee as far as Beth something. So again, why does it mention Muhammad in such an orderly location? And what's interesting, the later tradition scrubs this from the record. He never enters the promised land. Why remove this? Isn't that interesting that they have got rid of this? And in the standard Islamic narrative, he, a bit like Moses, he sees the promised land but never enters it, and Joshua takes over. So that's interesting that...
Okay, so this is 636, another reference. Where is this fragment that you're talking about? This fragment there?
This was written in the front of a gospel. I believe it was a Syrian gospel. And it is a contemporary reference. It's believed to have been written in the same year, 636.
And
it's about...
exactly is this Muhammad? This is the Ilyas ibn Qabisa?
I presume so. It doesn't give us enough information, but we'd have to assume that this is ES. And
can you then understand how this supports what we've been saying? This has been another question that has come up on the writing of Sabaeus. Sabaeus refers to a Muhammad who kills an awful lot of people. Well, this would be supported by this fragment here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Again, I don't know if you put those two together, because now when people say, there's a proof of Muhammad, no, it isn't. That what Sabaeus, the Christian cleric, is talking about is this Muhammad. This is the 7th century Muhammad. This would be supported by this fragment as well, if the date is 636.
Muslims can't get around the fact that in the Islamic standard narrative, Muhammad never goes to Syria, apart from in his childhood, which we'll grant, but we're talking about the conquests. He's meant to have died before this. He's meant to be dead and buried in 632. What's he doing alive in 636, according to this source? This.
And I think in the Sabaeus documents, he's in Jerusalem. That's, again, too far north.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we're seeing a picture here that it doesn't fit with the standard narrative. Now, there's lots of contradictions, and it's very hard to try and put together a consistent narrative, because there's contradictions. We don't understand exactly why there's contradictions. Maybe some people get it wrong, maybe they get their dates wrong, and so on. But clearly, when you gather all the sources together, it's painting a different picture, and it's painting an orderly location.
Well, it's painting the same picture. It's just different from the sin that you're talking about, standard Islamic narrative. Okay.
Yeah. Now, it might surprise many that an area in northern Iraq and Syria had been referred to as Arabia a long time ago. Now, this obviously may not be news to most people, but for some it might be new or news. Pliny the Elder, as far back as 79 AD, refers to Osroene and Commagene as Arabia. So those two areas in the middle of the map there, which are way up in northern Syria and northern Iraq. So he referred to that as Arabia. And Plutarch calls Abgar II an Arab philarch, and Tacitus calls Abgar V a king of the Arabs. Now, Abgar was ruling out of Edessa, which you can see city up there in Osroene. And this is quite strange for us because we think of Arabia nowadays as being just Saudi Arabia. But the notion of what was Arabia and who were the Arabians changed over time. And this is something that we have to grapple with. And it might be partly got to do with the fact that with the Southern narrative, our conception of where everything happened got changed. But we see here from nearly 2,000 years ago, references to Arabs being way up in the north.
Okay, and this is what we're talking about is Syria. If that's the area you're looking. I mean, it looks like almost southern parts of Turkey.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, actually.
Edessa. There's Edessa. That's southern part of Turkey. So we are way far north. And
Yeah.
when we say Arabia, we think of Saudi Arabia, which has only been around since the 1700s. So even that is something that we need to be careful that we try to get the names that are that were used, and also put it on a map. Thanks for putting it on the map so we can see that that Arabia would include all this northern area.
Yeah, and the Romans, I think it might have been in the 2nd century, I stand corrected, would have divided up Arabia then into the 3 regions. The Yemen area would have been called Arabia Felix, and then the central area would have been called Arabia Deserta, which means abandoned Arabia, because there was almost no one living there.
Which is all the more part of your whole thesis, isn't it? It's all abandoned. Why is it that Islamic traditions have incorporated and put enormous amount of sophisticated villages and towns and cities when there's nothing there? That's why the Romans said it. It's deserted.
Yeah. And way up north, then they called it Arabia Petraea, in connection with
Petra.
The importance of Petra.
There you go. So Nabatean. I love this.
Absolutely.
We should get a map and put that up there and keep reminding people everything about the later narratives is great for the 9th century, but absolutely hopeless for the 7th century.
Yep. Okay, so the Hispanic Chronicle of 754, due to its distance from events, its report seems to have survived the later changes. So even though this is quite late, it seems to represent the earlier narrative, the northern narrative, rather than the later one. And that's why I'm using this. The Saracens rebelled in 618, the 7th year of the Emperor Heraclius, and appropriated for themselves Syria, Arabia, and Mesopotamia, more through trickery than through the power of their leader Muhammad, and they devastated the neighboring provinces, proceeding not so much by means of open attacks as by secret incursions. Thus, by means of cunning and fraud rather than power, they incited all of the frontier cities of the empire and finally rebelled openly, shaking the yoke from their necks. Notice that Syria, Arabia, and Mesopotamia are Tayyaye areas. This confirms again the link between Muhammad and the Tayyaye. So this source is fantastic. It really tells us where it all began. It happened in Syria, Arabia, as in northern Arabia, and Mesopotamia. That's where it started. It didn't start the way the standard Islamic narrative says it started, way down south in the Hijaz. Now, another source, and you mentioned Sabios, a fantastic source. Here he says the following: so they, the Jews expelled from Edessa, departed, taking the road through the desert to Tashkistan, Arabia. You remember that Tashkistan? To the sons of Ishmael. The Jews called the Arabs to their aid and familiarized them with the relationship they had through the books of the Old Testament. In that period, a certain one of them, a man of the sons of Ishmael named Mahmed, became prominent. Mahmed taught them to recognize the God of Abraham. He ordered them all to assemble together and to unite in faith. Now, it's interesting. Where did he meet, or where did these Jews meet Muhammad? Was it down in the Hijaz?
No.
Or was it in Iraq?
There you go. Tajikistan, which would be Iraq. You're right. Yep. That's great. I mean, it just follows the same pattern.
And also the thing is, this person who's referred to as Muhammad, how could he order them all to assemble together? Who has the power to order people around and get them to assemble together? Do you think a wacky preacher in the desert would be able to do that? If they were, I don't know, what's his name? Billy Graham, maybe? But no, we're talking about someone who is in authority, and we're going to see more of that in part 2. But we see a clear indication that Muhammad and the Tayyaye are linked, and the Tayyaye are located in the north, i.e. Mesopotamia. It doesn't make clear if Muhammad was also located there due to the way it transitions to Muhammad, but it's suggested. Okay. And here's Tashkistan in northern Mesopotamia. And you can see this map is based on the period 610 to 641. Now you can see Tashkistan is located between the rivers Euphrates and the Tigris. And as you can see there, it stretches from, say, roughly Edessa all the way down to Ctesiphon. Okay. Now, we will come back to the most likely candidate for who this Muhammad was in part 2, but let's move on. This is a source that has become very famous in recent times on the channel, the Byzantine Arabic Chronicle of 741. This is the last
the Byzantia
vestige.
Arabica that we've talked about quite a bit, for those who are just wondering.
Yeah. So this is the last vestige of the old northern narrative. It's 741. Abdul al-Malik, assuming the apex of his kingdom, ruled for 20 years. In the first year of his rule, he directed all the experience and virtue of the mind of his army against Abdullah al-Zubair, whom his father had attacked so many times in various wars, all the way finally to Mecca, as they consider it, the home of Abraham, which lies in the desert between Ur of the Chaldeans and Kara, the city of Mesopotamia. Now, I think did I pronounce that correctly? Ur of the Chaldeans, I think I did. Yep. So let's have a look at where that is. It's up here. Okay. At least according to my reckoning, in those days, as just to recall, there was no knowledge of Ur being in southern Iraq. In those days, they would have presumed that Ur was in the same location as Edessa. But whether we take Ur as Edessa, the location associated with Abraham's birth according to local folklore, or if we take Ur to mean the location in southern Iraq, either way, Mecca would be somewhere in Syria or Iraq and not in the south. And this was a piece of evidence that Murad pointed out to me in his early version of the Iraqi thesis. So the idea that that Mecca existed somewhere between Ur and Karhe. Now, the only problem with his thesis was that he assumed that Ur was way down in southern Iraq. And for me, the problem with it as a source was that it was a huge distance between Karhe and Ur way down south. But as you can see in this map, if you assume that Ur is in Edessa and Karhe is, as you can see in the map, that's the same as Haran, then it's more precise. It's between a relatively short distance, and that makes more sense.
Can I just jump in here?
Yeah.
This is looking at that map there, and it's too bad we don't have a map of where the present day Ur is. That present day Ur, and this is where maybe Murad needs to be a little bit more careful. The present day Ur in southern Iraq was only discovered in 1853 by the British archaeologist. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. And so therefore it's a little over, we're coming up on 200 years ago, just not even 200 years ago when it was then brought down to Ur. But you're looking at the 8th century. In the 8th century, 741, mid 8th century, they hadn't yet discovered that Ur. So of course this would be where they thought Abraham came from. In the 8th century, we've got to always do, as we've said, always go back to the time period that we're referring to, not what we would know today. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of things wrong in history. And so that's a good reason why we need to understand that this was considered to be the birthplace of Abraham, or where he lived. And so therefore, it was wrong. That is true. But they hadn't yet discovered the real Ur.
And the other thing to bear in mind is what is meant by the Chaldeans, the Chaldees. Well, the Chaldees means the magicians. These are people who are into sort of magic and superstition and even Neoplatonism and all sorts of things. There was an academy in Athens that was closed down in the early part of the 6th century. And where did they move to? They moved to Haran, which is, as you say, down the road from Ur here on the map. So Edessa is Ur. So again, it's confirmation of a connection between the Chaldees and this location of Edessa. Okay. All right, so obviously the changing of the guards requires a changing of the narrative. So as you can see here, we have the old narrative, which is the Northern Historical Story, or NHS, as an acronym.
I love that. So for those of you who don't know why he's smiling and why he's laughing, the NHS is the National Health Service in Britain. And everybody swears by it for obvious reason, because it's what saves you. It's what heals you. It's the socialized medicine that has been one of the big success stories there in Britain for many, many years. So he's putting the NHS, Northern Historical Story, versus the Southern Islamic narrative, which is sin. Sin is the opposite of the NHS. So you're doing tongue in cheek. That the Northern story, Northern historical story, is the true story, and sin, as we know, is the false story in the South.
As you can see from the diagram, the old narrative and the new narrative overlap each other. So in the 680s, I believe, was when the new Southern narrative began to take shape, and then it became more definitive around the 750s when the Abbasids took over. And then from then onwards, the Southern narrative took over completely, and the old narrative was forgotten, with the exception maybe in local areas where it probably retained some memory, maybe for decades, possibly even for centuries. But essentially, in terms of the empire, it was all about the Southern narrative from that point onwards. Now, some sources suggest the beginnings of the Southern narrative. So let's take John Bar Pinkeye, 687, a sanctuary in the south. One of the Arabs by name Zubair made his voice heard from a distance. He made it known about himself that he had come out of zeal for the house of God, and he was full of threats against the Westerners, claiming that they were transgressors of the law. He came to a certain locality in the south where their sanctuary was and lived there. Now notice we see a touch of the Southern narrative there, but it is not clear where in the south he is referring to. Was it Petra? That would be south of the Western region. Was it Mecca in the Hijaz? If it was, then his contemporary Jacob, Bishop of Edessa, 684 to 688, flat out contradicts him. So this could be the very beginning of this idea of things having started from the south. So Jacob, Bishop of Edessa, as we said, this is one we've referred to before. It's referring to praying to the Kaaba, but doesn't say Mecca, so bear that in mind. For it is not to the south that the Jews pray, nor either do the Maghreb. The Jews who live in Egypt and also the Maghreb there, as I saw with my own eyes and will now set out for you, pray to the east and still do, both peoples, the Jews towards Jerusalem and the Maghreb towards the Kaaba. And those Jews who are to the south of Jerusalem pray to the north, and those in the land of Babel, in Hira, and in Basra pray to the west. And also the Maghreb who are there pray to the west towards the Kaaba, and those who are to the south of the Kaaba pray to the north towards that place. So from all this that has been said, it is clear that it is not to the south that the Jews and the Maghreb here in the regions of Syria pray, but towards Jerusalem or the Kaaba, the patriarchal places of their races. Now, if that didn't make any sense to you, I have a map. So what they're actually saying is that the people in Syria, the Jews and the Maghreb, they were praying south to here, but he has witnessed Jews and Maghreb to the west praying to the east, and those over here in Iraq praying west, and so on. So he's suggesting very clearly that this is where the Kaaba was and not further south.
Can I jump in there and hold that map there? We also have the archaeological work that was done by Creswell and Feravardi in 1905. Were the first to actually go to where you have Najaf and Karbala, to Kufa. Kufa would just be in that area, which would used to be Hira, just southwest of Babylon. And they were, I'm sorry, just southwest of Baghdad. That's where they did their digging, and they found the Wasit Mosque, and they also found the Kufa Mosque, the two of the oldest mosques. And they dug down to the original floor plans of those mosques, and they found the Qibla walls. And these are the first two Qibla walls that were discovered by Western archaeologists, 1905. And they noticed that the Qiblas were facing directly west. When they went over to the other side, it's just off the map, to Egypt. They went outside of Cairo to the old garrison town called Fustat. And there in Fustat, they dug down to the original floor plans, and they came to the Qibla wall of the original floor plans of the Fustat Mosque, and it's facing directly east. And so they noted this in 1905. Sure, that's over 100 years ago. They noticed this, that it looked like, and they suggested that looked like that the Qiblas were facing Jerusalem. Now we know now today, Dan Gibson has gone back there and gone both. He's gone to the Wasit Mosque, and he's also gone to the Kufa Mosque, and he's also gone to the Fustat Mosque. And he's made it. He's shown very carefully that both the Fustat and the Kufa Mosque are facing not Jerusalem, they're facing Petra. And the Wasit Mosque, the word itself means in between. It's facing in an in-between direction that's halfway between Petra and what is today Mecca. Now, for that reason, the archaeological evidence is supporting what Jacob of Edessa is saying here. Almost exactly. Jacob of Edessa would not have had GPS to know exactly where they were facing. He just assumed it was Jerusalem, but he was off by 3 to 5 degrees. Why? Because back then he wouldn't have anything. He wouldn't have known better. And so that's why it's fascinating today with GPS coordination. We know that actually they were not facing Jerusalem. They were both facing Petra in this case.
Yep. Now we move on to the Chinese sources. So Dashi, also written as that in Chinese characters, was the Chinese name for the Arabs and the Muslims in Persia and Central Asia in general. The name first appears in sources of the Tang period as Duoshi or Duoshi. The word is derived from the designation of one particular Arabian tribe called Taye or Tay that was in Middle Persian transformed into Tajik or Tazi, the origin of the state Tajikistan. So this is the connection with Tajikistan. Another explanation of the word Dashi is the Arabian word for merchant, Tajir. So it's interesting, there's a connection there between merchant and Tayaye. This will come to prominence later. Perhaps the idea that Muhammad was a Tajir, Pahlavi for a merchant, stems from him being a Tajir in the sense of being of the Tay tribe, right? So when we see in the sources sometimes Muhammad being referred to as a merchant, perhaps, and this is a hunch, that maybe the word that's being used is the word which means that he's a member of the Tay and not necessarily a merchant. So this is perhaps the origin of this whole story of Muhammad being a merchant, and that ties in with the wider Islamic narrative of Khadija and all this trading, and he was an honest guy and all that. Maybe this is built on a mountain of sand, and it is based on confusion about the word Tajir. So it's a possibility.
Good stuff.
A different story appears in the 750s after the takeover of the Abbasids. Now, this is very key because this is a smoking gun. You know, we're sometimes accused of a conspiracy theory because we're saying that there was an old narrative and a new narrative. But what if even the Chinese noticed this in the 750s? Well, this is exactly what we find. The Dashi, or the Tayayi, sent an envoy to China in 751 with a story of how they came to power. After 651, the Dashi sent envoys 3 more times, 701, 705, and so on. However, the Tang government noticed something peculiar, something odd, when they received envoys during the years of ZJ, 756 to 758 AD. They were told a completely different story of how the Dashi were founded. This time Muhammad's name appears, and the story this time is like the standard Islamic narrative we have today. The Chinese were confused, so they recorded both story versions, which is great that they did. But isn't that fascinating that at the time when the Abbasids had taken over in the 750s, suddenly the Chinese noticed that the story had changed. So,
and that's that we're talking about 756 now. This last one, when the Tang government notices something odd, and that's between 756 and 758.
Yep. So there's obviously something going on there. Why have the Abbasids changed the story? And I would suggest that one of the reasons is they're not going to be bragging about the Tayaye now, because they have been in a conflict. You know, inside the larger tribal group of the Tayaye, there's been a split. So this name no longer has major significance for them. They're going to emphasize in their new account how a subgroup are the real founders of what we call today Islam. And why would they do that? To justify the fact that they are in power. So they have changed the story as a way of holding on to power and to project their authority, their right to rule. Even as far away as China, they want to emphasize this. So it's fascinating. And here is the source itself. Notice that we still see traces of the old northern narrative, but the Quraysh and Muhammad are now central. So, as I said at the beginning, okay, this is a significant change, but we can still see a slow evolution. It will take a couple of decades later with Ibn Ishaq and then later again with Ibn Hisham for this story to fully ferment and become a completely different story. But here we can see elements of both the old and the new narrative. So let me just get straight into it then. Another saying, is that the ruling clan of the Dashi, Tayyei tribe, is called Guli or Quraysh during the year of Kai Huan of the Su dynasty. There are two families within I'm going to use Quraysh or Quraysh just to make it clear. One family is called Penni Shishan, which is the Banu Hashim, and the other is Penni Mohuan, or the Banu Marwan. There was a man from the Penni Shishan called Moki Mo, that's Muhammad, who was very brave and wise and was hailed as the king by the tribe people. The king, Moki Mo, then expanded the kingdom's territory stretching across 3,000 leagues from east to west with his mighty forces. He also conquered the city of Shiala, which is Syria, which is called City Shan, which is Damascus. Now, before anyone says this, the Chinese are rendering these words in Chinese, and they're doing their best to get the closest representation of the word according to how they are hearing it.
That's called transliteration, and we do that even today. If you were to go into any dictionary or you go into any encyclopedia and you look up the word Muhammad, just look at that word, even in English, how would you write that? In modern standard English, it could be Mohemmed or Muhammad. Look at the word Quran. It's a lot, and for many years it used to be Koran, but now it is Qur''an. They're completely different spellings, almost look like completely different words, but it's actually the same word. And so this, when you transliterate it, you try to write it in your script as you hear it coming from the foreigner's voice. And so that makes, when they heard it, the Chinese heard the people who were coming from the Abbasids, when they were referring to Muhammad, they heard it as Mokemo. So that's why they wrote it Mokemo.
Yeah, so notice that it's saying that there's a ruling clan within the Tayyei. So if you imagine the larger group is the Tayyei, and then within this large group, you have the ruling clan, which is the Quraysh, which I'm going to suggest based on later evidence we'll see in a second. They are the Persian group within the Tayyei. So the Tayyei is a tribe which is transnational. It doesn't stick nicely within the borders. It's a mobile tribe that spreads across Iraq, Syria, and even into Persia. Now, there's a subgroup, as I say, the ruling clan, which are the Quraysh, okay? And this is what we've discovered. And within that group called the Quraysh, there are two important families. There's the Banu Hashim, and there's the Banu Marwan, right? Now, the Banu Hashim is connected with Muhammad, according to the Chinese source. And notice the other one, the Banu Marwan. Why is that significant, Jay?
Well,
Marwan.
Because the Marwanid family are the ones that come into power in 680. They're the ones that take over and subvert the Sufyani family, which Muawiyah was a part of, and they were a subgroup that then become the dominant group within the Umayyad dynasty. So we know the dates for that; those are well known. So it's fascinating that even they're being picked up in these Chinese sources.
Yeah. So you can see here that from the point of view of the 750s, the Chinese are basically saying that we are from the real people that started everything are the Quraysh. It wasn't the Tayyeh. They're basically saying no, it's not these low-life Arabs as they probably would have viewed them. You know, from the Persian point of view. No, it was the ruling clan that were key to all of this, because both the Umayyads and in terms of the ruling group, the Umayyads and the Abbasids were Persian. So they were the ones that were in charge, okay? And we see that by the 750s, the Banu Marwan have been suppressed and the Banu Hashim have taken over. And they are the Abbasids, essentially. That's how I read it, at least.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting.
No, this is terrific. I mean, you can understand then why they've come to these conclusions.
Yeah. Now, it goes on to say that the Quraysh, with its Marwan clan and the Hashim clan, were the white-coated Arabs. Now, bear this in mind that with the identities here, they're referred to here as Arab, but there are other Chinese sources that will say that the ruling clan were in fact Persians. So if you imagine a pyramid, on the top you have the Persians, and underneath you have the Arabs who are doing all the fighting for them. You know, so there's that going on. A person from Mulu in Khorasan, in Persia, called Abu Muslim, plotted to overthrow Marwan. He announced to the people that whoever was on his side should put on black clothes. He soon collected an army of several thousand men and slew Marwan. Abu al-Abbas of the clan of Hashim was chosen king, and henceforth they were known as the black-coated Arabs. And this, in the Chinese, is the explanation for why the Abbasids are in charge. So it's very interesting.
So the black-coated would be the Abbasids, the white-coated would be the Umayyads.
Exactly, yeah. Now, despite the Chinese sources referring to these key clans as white-dressed Arabs, then black-dressed Arabs, it is clear from another Chinese source that these are more precisely to be termed Persians. This contradiction is due to centuries of border changes. These same people could be termed Tayyeh, Mesopotamian, Arab, and/or Persian. Border changes meant a fluid sense of identity, but I think the key thing to draw out of all of this is that the elite were always the Persians. Okay. Now, so some more sources. The Gospel of the 12 Apostles, 692 to 705, and there shall rise up from among them a warrior and one whom they called prophet, and they shall be brought into his hands, and the south shall prosper. And by the hooves of the horses of its armies it shall trample down and subdue Persia and devastate Rome. So we can see elements of the south appearing in the narratives. So we go on to the next one. So we have the short Syriac chronicle of 775, which says, and Muhammad and the Arabs went forth from the south and entered the land and subdued it. As you can see there, there's a focus on the south there. And then we turn to the chronicle of 1234. And this one I got from Stephen Shoemaker. He said that the chronicle of 1234 was based on the Dionysius chronicle of 845, which in turn borrows from the chronicle of Theophilus of Edessa in around the year 750. So, you know, have to take that, you know, with a pinch of salt, you know, because it's the source based on a source based on a source. But it says anyway, therefore this Muhammad, while in the measure and stature of youth, began to go up and come down from his city Yathrib to Palestine for the business of buying and selling. So you can see here but
let me just jump in here. You're saying that this was written in 845, being redacted or borrowing from something, the Theophilus of 750, way up in Edessa. And so that would fit perfectly, because by that time Mecca, and it would have been called Mecca at that time. Why they're still calling it Yathrib, I don't know. Mecca would be well known by 750.
Yeah, but I suppose, you know, if we take it in terms of the Chinese sources, we can see that, you know, by the year 750 there's a strong beginning of the southern narrative. Now, when exactly it started, you know, in terms of a full story, it's hard to say, but we can see elements of it gradually coming into focus here with this source here. Okay,
that's great.
Now we move on to the following. With the rise to power of the Abbasids, the southern narrative was supported and the northern narrative was suppressed. Mecca in the Hijaz offered many advantages. It was a clean slate on which to write their new story how they liked it. Islam's Persian origins could be erased. The Quran's origins as the patched together writings of a Jewish Christian sect with its Idumean or Petra links could be hidden and replaced with a tale of an ignorant prophet who got it all sent down by an angel. Islam's origins as a rags to riches tale was preferable to a Persian oligarchical power struggle. What better way to stop the Arabs rebelling against the Persians than for the Persians to lead the way and then to remake their first leader into an Arab? Arabs then think they are in charge when it is in fact still the Persians. So that's how I see this move down to the south. It suited the Abbasids. They could rewrite history the way they wanted it. They could ignore the early stories about the Tayyaye, and they could say instead that it was the Quraysh, which is their clan, that was the instigators from the beginning. So it suited them down to the ground. And the cherry on the cake was to give a new narrative around the key protagonist of Iyas, or Muhammad, and to make him come across as if he were an Arab. So that's the idea that I see of how it came about. So the conclusion then, really, of part one is that the standard Islamic narrative is wrong about where Islam began. It says Islam began in the Hijaz, but that turns out to be false. The real story began with the Tayyaye way up in the north. So that's it, Jay.
Terrific. This is good. Let's go ahead and stop your sharing there. And I'd like to just kind of, these are the notes that I took, and I've taken 2 full pages of notes here. Let me just go through so we can tie it all together. Because what you've done here, you've put together this scenario of the north going to the south, and in that direction. And I love the fact that you've named the northern historical story versus the south, which is sin. And that's the southern Islamic narrative. Terrific. So let's just take that and let's go ahead, put that in and unpack it. And what you started out by saying, you took 4, you start out by saying 4 criteria that you're going to be using as your dictums. The first idea that this whole idea of Muhammad is a composite fiction. It doesn't come suddenly. It evolves over, in this case, you're talking about 150 years. And that the earliest Muhammad, the 7th century Muhammad, please be careful, folks. Don't think that that's the Muhammad of the 9th century. He's nothing to do with the 9th century. Get that out of your head. The same name, yes, but not the same person. That's good that you made that emphasis, and I'm glad we've got that there. And then you said, to understand what I'm saying, let's look and see how it went from the north to the south. And so you're saying that's a progression as well. So you're going from Muhammad to Muhammad, the Muhammad of the 7th century, moving to the Muhammad of the 9th century, and you're also going from the north down to the south. And that the earliest sources, this is the ones that we're going to, the 7th century, they confront that narrative that's in the 9th century, and they also help us see where it goes along that path. And I love what you've done in this entire episode. You've taken us along that path. And you start by saying, let's go back to the 7th century. Who is there? It's the Tayyaye. And they have been expurged. That's why we don't know anything about them, because they have been thrown out by all the later traditions. But you do to say that these Tayyaye, they have a history, and they start way down in the south, not the South Hijaz, but the South Yemen, what would be to Yemen today, the Hadramaut at that period. And you're saying way back in the 2nd century. So there would be no, there probably, or I shouldn't say no, but there's probably very little memory of that part of the Tayyaye. They come from the Yemen, from the very far south, and they go all the way up to Shamar, which is what would be the Nabatean area. That would be Edom, and that would be Petra, and what today would be Jordan, and I guess you might say parts of Israel. So they go to the north. Then by the 6th century, so that's the 2nd century, by the 6th century, they then split into 2 groups, And the two groups are Syria, the Ghassanids in Syria, and the Lakhmids in Iraq. So now we're in the 6th century. And then by the 7th century, those two groups, which if anybody has studied their history, you will know that the Ghassanids became a buffer state for the Byzantines, and the Lakhmids become a buffer state for the Persians or the Sassanids. That's well known historically. So it's great that you've done this. So now we then move into the 7th century, because these two groups, the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids, they produce two different individuals who are also in competition to each other. From the Ghassanid area, you have Muawiyah, and from the Lakhmid area, you have Ali. Go ahead. What did you want to say there?
Yeah, just be careful not to identify them too closely. So just be aware that the Tayyi were a subgroup within the Ghassanids. They weren't identical with the Ghassanids. They were part of the Ghassanid population, not the entire population. And same with the Lakhmids. They were a significant group within the population that had huge influence, but they weren't the entire population.
Okay.
If that makes sense, yeah.
That's a great corrective. Now, let me ask you this. Muawiyah, would he be a Tayyi?
I would say yes, yeah. There's evidence from the Chinese source that talks about that. In fact, that there were, if I can remember it correctly, there was the Marwan clan and there was the Hashim clan within the Tayyi, and they put Muawiyah in one group, and I think Muhammad is in the other group, as best as I remember.
And Muhammad would be the one that's in the Lakhmids, which is where Ali would come from as well. So then you move over to Tajikistan, and you talk about this Tajikistan, which is further east yet, because this became the homeland for the Tayyi, and that was the land of the Tayyi, which is what we would consider today the Euphrates Valley, the Mesopotamia, the place actually where Abraham came from. But you then moved over and you said, let's look at, and then you really moved into say, now let's take this northern narrative, this northern historical story, NHS. Let's look and see what historical support we have for this. And I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different supports you gave. Let's go through them real quickly, just to remind ourselves. You started with Thomas the Presbyter in 640, who refers to the Tayyi. He talks about this Muhammad who has a battle with the Romans, and he uses the word Mahmud, and that would be the Pahlavi spelling of the word Muhammad. So that is in 640. You see the name come up. But that Muhammad is not the Muhammad of the 9th century. That's the Muhammad of Ilya ibn Qabisa, which we're going to be getting into in the next episode. You then move to 636. You kind of bound back 4 years with a fragment of Arab conquest. And that's in Syria. So here you have Thomas Presbyter is way in Pahlavi area. That's off to the east in what today is Iran. And then you move and say, listen, the fragment of the Arab conquest also refers to Muhammad killing many people, but way over in Syria. So here's this Muhammad head is appearing again, but not the Muhammad of the 9th century. And that's where this confusion keeps coming in. This is the Muhammad of Syria, again, in the north. And then you go way back to 79 AD with Pliny the Elder, who refers to this Osrohen, I don't know how to pronounce it either, but he refers to this whole area, the smaller land up there in the north, very far north, as Arabia. So we know we're talking about Arabia in the north again. And I think a lot of people would have thought, oh, that must be Saudi Arabia today, because they're thinking of the fact that that's what it's called on our maps today. No, this is much further north. In fact, that includes, as you put on the map, that also includes parts of southern Turkey and northern Syria. And then you get to the Hispanic Chronicle of 754. Now that's the time when the Abbasids are coming into play. They are already into play. And you talk about the fact that this refers back to 618 to the Saracids rebelling against these Tayyi. They rebel against known as the Tayyi, and they are, according to this chronicle, they are in Syria, Arabia, and Mesopotamia. And the Arabia, of course, as we know from Pliny the Elder, would include Syria. So that's much further north again. And that their leader is Muhammad again. So there's this is why you're leading up to what we're going to be doing in the next episode. The fifth evidence you come up with Sabaeus in 660s. Sabaeus, well known, he talks and he does use the name Muhammad, but he says this Muhammad, and he refers to him as, again, part of the Tayyi and in Tajikistan. So that again shows that this Muhammad we're talking about is a 7th century Muhammad. He's not the 9th century Muhammad. And then number 6, you come up with the Byzantia Arab Chronicle. You call it that. I know it as the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius Continuata Arabica. It's a huge name, but it's become so famous because Patricia Crone made it so famous from 741. Which refers to Mecca. Of course, people have jumped on that saying, oh, that's the Mecca. Even Patricia Crone says, that's the Mecca we're looking for. No, it isn't. Because as you've pointed out, that Mecca is way up in Edessa near Haran, which is in southern Turkey. That would have been where most people in the 8th century, well, all the people in the 8th century thought that Abraham was born and grew up and spent his life. So that's why it makes sense then that they was known as the land of Abraham. Too far north because the real Ur has not yet been found yet. Was not been found until the 1800s. And that's where you say that the beginning of the sin comes in, or the southern Islamic narrative starts to introduce. And I love what you did by putting up that graph of that timeline there, because you said there's a bit of an interlap between the northern NHS and the SIN coming in later on. So the NHS starts to disappear once the southern Islamic narratives comes in, and that starts to take over. But there is a little bit of interlap, and you're putting it at the date around 680 is where the southern narrative starts to be introduced. And what's great is you start with someone like John Benkari. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 again proofs that you brought forward to help understand that evolution of the southern narrative. And you start with John Bar Benkari in 687, who refers to Zubair, who remember was the governor underneath Abd al-Malik, lived in Petra, rebelled against the governor, against Abd al-Malik, and destroys Petra and takes the Black Stone with him. And as he takes the Black Stone, we haven't really got into the Black Stone yet. We need to do that, Mel, because what we're now finding out is the Black Stone is always where God's presence is. So when you take the Black Stone with you, you take God's presence with you. So when he then flees to the south, you can see then all the pilgrims follow him. They want to go where the Black Stone is. Now that's a whole nother time, but what you do say is this is the beginning then of that movement down south, where now everything moves south. And then you give the example of Jacob Edessa, who writes about this. Some people, you put it to around 688. Most people put that document to 705. Again, 8th century. And that he's talking about the fact that the people over there in Wasit and in Kufa are paying west, and those in Egypt and Fustat are playing east. And he thought in 705 that this was Jerusalem. He was off by 3 to 8 degrees, as we now know today. Nonetheless, that's the understanding, because it's obvious that they were not playing south. It was where they should have been praying for. So already you can see now that he's locating this further north. Nonetheless, the Chinese then come in, and this is what I love. You're bringing in some extra Quranic material, and what makes this so powerful is that they would have no agenda. They are neutral observers, not servitors, what a terrible word. Observers. As neutral observers, you can trust them better, and they also would have not had any doctored material. By virtue of the fact that this is all coming out of China, there'd be no way that the Abbasids could control this. They would not have been able to eradicate it. And so that's why in some ways they're much more objective. Being more objective, they're the better people to look at to see, because they are noticing that there's a difference, and they're seeing that there is a difference between the north and south again. And what do they say? Well, they talk about these people from Tayay. They call them Dashi, and they you talk about their name Dashi, which is the Chinese rendering of Tayay. That again, it's transliteration. You would not pronounce it. They would not pronounce it the same way we would pronounce it, but that's how they wrote it. And that they have envoys that come in 705, 711, 741, and then 756. And that those who come in 705, 711, 741 say one thing, and that is that this is all much further north. These are the Tayai they're working with. But when they come in 756 to 758, under the Tang government, everything seems to change. And there's a difference in their envoys coming, and they're saying there's a big change going on now. And they're saying they refer to Muhammad by name. Now they're referring to this man named Muhammad by name. They talk about the Qurayshi who are introduced in their documents. And they're mentioned that these Qurayshi, who they call Guli, you can see the transliteration, and they don't call him Muhammad, they call him Mokemo. Mokemo would be the way they pronounce Muhammad. But they talk about these Quraysh who are the Persian elite. They are the Persian elite. They're off in the east, and they're referring to that. That should wake us all up, because now we're seeing that the Abbasids, who are from the east, they are from much further north, they hate the Umayyads. We now see that. And the Chinese are actually showing where this sequence happens. It happens somewhere between 741 and 758. Well, who comes to power between 741 and 758 but the Abbasids? They take over power in 749. And they are the ones that take the headquarters from Damascus and bring it down to what is today Baghdad, called Ctesiphon back in those days. So that's amazing. What you're showing here, see, you're listening it for the first time, and you're actually showing, from looking at all these documentations that you have been able to glean all over the place, Mel, you're actually recreating what I've already known, but didn't know how to put any bones, any meat to, because I only had the bare bones. You're putting the meat to it by showing the documentation that supports it. I've always known that there was a difference between the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and you can see that immediately, because why would you take headquarters up in Damascus, which has been the headquarters all the way since the time from 622? Why would you take it down to Baghdad over there in the east, unless, of course, you are bringing an entirely new empire? The Chinese picked this up, and it's there in their documentation. They would not have an agenda here. They're just writing what their envoys are coming back with and what they're noticing. And they're noticing that these people in the east, they're in Baghdad and further east, they are Qurayshi, they are Persians. And they refer to them now. Do they refer to them, or are you referring to them as the white coats, black coats?
They are actually the Chinese themselves are actually describing what they wore. So that's in the sources. And I have an image for you to make it clear for everyone. So you imagine a chessboard. You have the white pieces on one side, they are the Umayyads. On the other side, you have the black pieces.
Okay, those are the Abbasids. Okay.
And
so white piece chess, in their cases, they say, coach, in your case, let's just use a Chinese chessboard to even make it more clear.
Yeah. And the pawns are the Arabs. All the elite are the back row. The kings, the queens, the knights, they are the powerful ones at the back. The Arabs are the pawns. They are the cannon fodder for all of the Persian
that's an interesting way to put it.
That's the way I would describe it.
So it's fascinating how you're bringing this whole Chinese element into it. I love you're doing that, because that makes your argument so much more powerful, because of the fact that they don't have an agenda. They are neutral observers. There's no reason why they would lie. They would not try to doctor the material for any political gain on their part. They're just noticing, and they're putting it out there. And what they're noticing is there is a difference. There's a change between 741 and 758. And then you bring in the Gospel of 12 Apostles in 705. That precedes the Chinese material. And this Gospel of 7 Apostles, again, brings up this idea of this movement down south. The short Syriac Chronicle of 775 refers to all this that's happening down in the south. So that's redacting it back to, again, this would be well into the Abbasid area. And then you talk about the Chronicles 1234 of Dionysius. That's dated to 845, but it's referring to material that was lifted from Theophilus of Edessa in 750, and referring to this movement from the north to the south. Brilliant stuff. Why did they do this? And this is how you end. And this is what I love. Why would the Abbasids try to eradicate everything that have gone ahead? Why do they create a whole new place and a whole new person and a whole new narrative? Why this narrative from NHS down to SIN, NHS down to SIN? From the northern historical story, which should remain, well, that's because that's the Umayyad story. They don't want anything to do with the Umayyads. They want to eradicate the Umayyads. They want a clean slate. They want a completely new clean slate. Therefore, they have the book, the man, the place, and the narrative. So they eradicate that, and they bring back they erase any Persian origins, which is in the north. They erase any Idumean origins. For people who don't know what we're talking about, that's Edomite origins. You've gone through this with Job. And then they want to show that their prophet was not a king like the original Muhammad was. He was a king. He had 30 villages. He was powerful. He was a Christian on top of that. Their prophet is not a Christian. Their prophet is a Muslim, and he comes from rags to riches. Well, every prophet goes from rags to riches. So there is that same narrative that's all through the Bible. We have that same story. We even have it now in this story, this new narrative, which is a Southern narrative. It is Southern Islamic narrative, now makes him rags that becomes rich from Mecca to Medina. And then, of course, they introduced the Quraysh, the Quraysh who are the tribe, supposedly, of Muhammad. We can't find any reference of any people called Quraysh anywhere that far south, nor certainly not from Mecca and Medina. And that's why then they introduced their prophet. So I hope, I mean, this has been fascinating. I love this kind of stuff because you're taking a whole swath of history, looking over a period of at least about 100, maybe even 150 years you're looking at. You're showing that almost everything is in the north. It's the Umayyad narrative that's in the north. It now needs to be brought down to the south. That new narrative, this Southern Islamic narrative, has to make sure that that narrative is the one that is then imposed. And that's why it takes then to the 9th century, another century later, to finally get it written down with Ibn Hisham in 833, and then finally they get it all put together by 870 when Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, and all those start putting the sayings together. And the story itself is finally created in 923, the 10th century. So this would make sense. This is fascinating because we now understand how the Abbasids wanted to eradicate and introduce their own narrative. Good stuff. So what's the next episode?
The next episode, we're going to look at who the protagonists for the beginnings of Islam. So that's what we're going to look at.
Oh, so we're going to go back to the original Muhammad. We're going to go back to the first Muhammad, the 7th century Muhammad. Oh, I can't wait. This is going to be fun. And God, listen, for those of you who have been following us, you've been seeing what Mel and his group have been doing in Sneakers Corner. Please, please, please continue to unpack what he's saying. Don't just sit there and read it and say, that was a great video. We love what you're doing. Say, what is it about that you're finding that is helpful? To also hammer us. Try to get us, put us on the back foot. Try to see if you can find any chinks in Mel's armor. He loves that. This is what he thrives for, and this is why he stays up late at nights, just to make sure that he answers all your questions. We're going to stick this up there, throw it up there, and then we're going to look and see what kind of response we get from you all. God bless you. This has been fun, Mel. Thanks so much for coming on board. Okay, this is Mel. Right over there, over in Europe, and me here in the United States. We're about 3,000 miles apart, but isn't technology great? We can sit there, still talk to you face to face. Over and out.